Today's first speaker is someone that you may recognize if you tuned in last week. She gave us a very fantastic and efficient 15-minute introduction to blockchain, which is a no mean feat, let's put it that way. So we're going to welcome her. I'm just going to introduce her a little bit, and she's going to come and say hi to you all. So she's been named, among other things, I think if I introduce all of her accolades, we might be here for the whole hour and a half, but among other things, she's been named Forbes' leading evangelist for blockchain. She is the CIO for Molinari Media, if I'm correct, as well as holding other positions, including an industry expert at UCL's very own Center for Blockchain. So close to home for some of us who might be UCL students. And I'm just going to welcome her, and hopefully she can say hi and introduce herself as well a little bit. Hi, Jane. How are you?
Hello, everyone. Really great to be here with you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for being here. So I think, Jane, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're going to be giving a presentation where you talk a little bit about some of the applications of blockchain that can have some positive impacts outside of just some of what we might envision in our heads, right?
Yeah, that's right. I want to broaden it from financial inclusion because I think financial inclusion and identity is related to so many other areas that blockchain can also have a transformational impact.
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay, so I'm just gonna get out of your way here and put up your PowerPoint, and then you can get started.
Thanks, Serena, and hi again, everyone. What I wanted to talk more broadly about is around how blockchain relates to the Sustainable Development Goals and the different ways in which it can contribute to many of these. So I'm going to highlight a few, and financial inclusion is one. But if you go to the next slide, I just want to focus on first the key kind of efficiencies or elements or characteristics of blockchain that make it so valuable as a tool to be able to empower the bottom billion and link them with the global economy. Because if you start with the premise of people being unbanked, that means they're not participating in the global economy. So it's fast, it's secure, it's efficient, it's transparent, and it's cheap. And these features will continue to resonate throughout the rest of the presentation. So if we go to the next slide, what I've tried to demonstrate there is just a number of the different ways in which blockchain provides a critical use case that can be useful in terms of the Sustainable Development Goals and supporting the poor and vulnerable. So the one that you're probably most familiar with, of course, is digital currencies and fast payments, but there are many more. Supply chain, health records, provenance, transportation, voting, energy, taxation, tokenizing welfare payments, government engagement with citizens, land titles, and industry creation. And as we go through, many of these have actually come to prominence during the COVID pandemic. So supply chain, for example, has been one that's received a lot of attention, both because of the breakdown in supply chains and also because of the proliferation of fake personal protection equipment that took place during the pandemic. So we'll come back to a number of these. So let me move on to the next slide and just put some big numbers in front of you, which really demonstrate clearly that this is not about a technology looking for a problem. This is about very real problems that exist today that we may be able to solve using technology. So if you start with identity, identity is the key to almost everything. And we have 1.1 billion people in the world today who have no identity. So without identity, you can't get a bank account. In some countries, you can't go to school. In some countries, you can't access healthcare. You certainly can't be able to register your property. So this is a critical factor in almost everything that we want to do if we want to include people in the global economy. Next slide, please. So the next point is around just how many people in the world are unbanked. And it's estimated there's 2 billion people in the world who are unbanked. And the majority of those are women. And so this is an issue that needs to be addressed. The third key point that I want to highlight is around, next slide please, is access to energy and electricity. So we have about 2 billion people in the world who have no access to energy. And these are issues that blockchain can certainly help solve. Next slide, please. If you think about financial services and financial inclusion, one of the things that you need to think about is that many people in the world survive on remittances that have been sent by their relatives who are overseas migrant workers. So this is a real example from a country called Papua New Guinea, which is north of Australia and has a very high rate. 85% of the population are unbanked. And it's one of the most expensive remittance corridors in the world. So I just want to illustrate a story so you can understand how important digital remittances can be for people. So if we start with this lady here, her relative is working in Australia and wants to send her $200. Now, depending on whether it's a bank or a post office or a money transfer operator, they're going to take anything from $20 to $40 out of the 200. So have that in your mind. In any event, it's been sent and there's only 160 to be received. Now, this woman lives in a remote village. There is no bank in her village. So even though she's been sent the remittance, she can't receive it in her village. So what she needs to do is take some form of public transport to the nearest town with a bank. And in this particular use case, that cost her $60 and took approximately 6 hours. So she has to spend a day traveling down to the place with the banking facility to receive the $160, which becomes 100 because she just spent 60 going to get it. She needs to spend the next day getting the money, and then she needs to spend a third day traveling back to her village, which costs her another $60. So in the end, out of the $200, she barely has any money left because of the cost taken by the remittance provider and also the transportation cost. Serena, I think there's one more button you can press if you wouldn't mind. Yeah, thank you. To bring up, sorry, so the amount of loss that she experiences on that $200 remittance is significant, both because of the time and transportation as well as the actual charge by the remittance provider. And if you then think about what could be possible for the lives of people like her, a digital transfer to a mobile phone could result in no loss of time and virtually no loss in the transfer fees. And that's hugely powerful if you actually think about the volume of the remittance market in developing countries. So let's just go on to the next slide and I'll take you through some examples of where blockchain can actually address some of these global challenges that we have. So Serena, please press forward. Yeah, just press forward 4 times because otherwise I've just got to keep telling you to do it. Thank you. So I've mentioned the issue of identity and I've emphasized that that's a prerequisite for financial services, but it's also a prerequisite for many other kinds of government services. Financial inclusion, if the unbanked don't have access to any financial services, and with digital rollout of money systems, you could provide that kind of access to people, including people like the woman that I spoke of, who live in remote villages where there are no banks or post offices. With land assets and registration, many poor people actually have land. It might be communal land or it might be privately owned land, and they're able to convert that to value if they're able to actually register their land, link it to an identity and prove ownership, because then they're able to borrow against it and they're able to invest in businesses and so forth. Another area which I'll talk about a little bit more which people probably don't think about that much, is, again, if you think of the remittance scenario and you think of philanthropy and money from donors like DFID, a proportion of that is also spent with the middleman who's transmitting the money down to the recipients that they want to reach. So if you think about something like the Global Fund for TB, malaria and HIV, they actually pay local fund agents in every country, and it's often the major financial accounting firms like PwC and EY, just to make sure that the money isn't misused and it gets down to the recipients. So if you actually worked on being able to transmit these large billions of dollars of donor funds to recipients using smart contracts and connecting to the identity of the recipients, you could cut out anything from 10 to 20% of donor funds, the total amount. And if you go and have a look at what DFID spends, it's well into the billions. So these are significant amounts of money and significant reforms that can be made possible through blockchain. Let's go to the next slide. So I just want to touch on some sectors here, because again, all of these, while they're not directly about financial inclusion, they're about citizens' rights and citizens' access to services. So they're tremendously important. And many poor people get their livelihoods through agriculture. And often farmers don't receive a fair deal on their products, and middlemen both take cuts all along the supply chain and slowly increase the price, and there's a lack of transparency in provenance. And provenance actually is one of the areas that's moving quite fast in terms of supply chain, both because of some scares like mad cow disease, for example, but also that people are increasingly interested in where their food comes from. So some of the big outlets like Tesco's and Walmart, for example, are paying people to be able to track the provenance of their goods from the farm to the shop, so you know that the coffee that you're buying actually was grown in the Ethiopian highlands, for example. And that also enables the farmer to get a fairer deal. Another one which I think is of considerable interest and prominence at the moment is around democracy and lack of trust in government. So there are a number of projects around the world where people are working on blockchain-based voting systems, and I'll talk a little bit about it shortly with another couple of slides, because blockchain enables the increase of trust and transparency in the electoral process, but it also makes it far more convenient for voters because you don't have to leave your home and go to another place to vote. Climate change and green energy, I'll also speak about more, because there's a couple of areas that are really important in terms of where blockchain can contribute. One is in the actual movement of climate finance, as I spoke about remittances and as I spoke about donor funds. The other one is in the tracking of carbon credits. And then finally, in the production and consumption of green energy at a village level, and I'll talk more about that. And I'll also cover health. And of course, being in the pandemic, we've seen a real acceleration of innovation in terms of healthcare, both with blockchain solutions as well as other technological solutions to help people combat the pandemic. So just going on to the next slide briefly, and then go to the next slide. So this is just the heading slide for climate finance and green energy. And this is an example of a small solar power in India. Now, solar power, the prices come down and down, so people are able to purchase a solar power grid of this size, or even a much smaller one for household use. And what's possible with blockchain and cryptocurrencies is that someone who owns a small solar panel is able to sell micro amounts of power. So, for example, you live in a rural village which has no power, and you can go to the person with the solar panel and you can buy a small amount of energy to charge your mobile phone or to charge a solar light and make a micropayment using cryptocurrencies. So this creates both a small business opportunity for people in villages, as well as actually enabling people to access small amounts of energy. Next slide, please. So if we think about humanitarian disasters and refugee settings, interestingly, but not surprisingly, this is actually an area where tremendous innovation is going on, both with blockchain and with other technologies. And it's somewhat akin to the pandemic, because when you're in an emergency situation, then you're not so concerned about legacy systems and regulation and all of the reasons not to innovate. You need to innovate because you're saving lives or averting disasters. So if we go to the next slide, I'll take you through a few examples of where humanitarian and technology or technology is being used in humanitarian settings to be able to improve the way that people are responding to disasters. So we start with drones, blockchain and data analytics, tracking populations on the move, because people aren't already in camps. Often they're fleeing a war-torn situation and moving from place to place and seeking shelter where they can find it. And this is a setting where often it's not safe for others to go. And so using drones with blockchain and data analytics, they can track these populations on the move. The second one, which I emphasize frequently, is around identity, because this allows people access to entitlements and different transactions. But it also, if you think about, say, professionals who fled Syria, they almost certainly fled without their university transcripts or their certificates of different courses and skills that they have. And so that means that when they get to a destination, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to be able to relink back to their credentials to prove that they have professional certifications and that they actually have skills to work, as well as linking back to their bank accounts, as well as linking back to property. So again, identity allows them to link back with their history, but it also enables them within the camps, if they get to a camp, to be able to receive benefits. So one of the most well-known examples of this is the World Food Programme Building Blocks program, where they're using blockchain and digital tools to be able to give credits to people to buy things from the stores in the camps. But it also allows people in camps, in refugee settings, to do peer-to-peer value exchange. It enables people employment opportunities, creating a digital workforce for people who have those sorts of skills. And I was very interested recently to be reading about a project called Electronium, which might be of interest to some of you to look at, because they're creating, not for humanitarian settings, but exactly this, so people can undertake work through, if you like, the gig economy and be paid in cryptocurrencies. It can harness new tools to open pathways for securing livelihood and economic opportunity. And also in terms of the funds administration and remittances, it's an important way to be able to reduce the cost of the funds administration and transfer of remittances and get them directly to the correct beneficiaries. And then finally, I just want to alert you to the challenge of human trafficking, which is a whole presentation on its own. But if people don't have identities, women, children without identities can very easily be trafficked and very easily be given fake identities and moved through bypassing the authorities. So identity is a key to preventing human trafficking, and human trafficking is something that happens commonly in refugee, humanitarian and crisis situations. So let's move on to the next slide. I think I'm probably going too long, so I'm going to hurry up. The tracking and tracing of donor funds, I've spoken about it at some length, looking at how it allows to validate transactions. Smart contracts can ensure that the funds reach the recipients. It has transparency, so you can track and trace, for example, with the provenance of pharmaceuticals, because fake drugs is a big challenge. Speed, I've mentioned already. Reduced procurement time. So this is a real example from the US government, where they reduced the procurement time from 100 days to 10 days by using blockchain and AI to assess the proposals from bidders for a big procurement contract. So estimates vary, but it could be as much as 150 billion is lost in funding through the leakage of donor funds and also through the inefficiency of the way that we do it. So moving on to the next slide. This is just, yes, Serena, yeah, thank you. This is just a schematic showing the different, back to agriculture. This is a schematic of, yeah, thank you, of the different points at which blockchain can intervene in an agriculture supply chain and can add value. So crop insurance, crop loans, very important for farmers, asset tracking, supply chain provenance, fast payments, and land registration, certification, and subsidy vouchers. So all of these things are being applied in agriculture around the world using blockchains. So just moving on very quickly, and Serena, you can move through the next slide and go on to the next one. This is blockchain thinking about state-citizen relations, because one of the things that blockchain can do is severely reduce the cost of voting and government engaging with citizens. So these are real numbers from Australia, and you can tell it's Australia because of the attire of the people in the picture, but it actually costs us $2,261 to vote in a state election by the time all the overheads are applied. If you use a blockchain solution, it's estimated that this could be reduced to 50 cents per vote. And that's a huge difference. And what it also enables, if you go on to the next slide, is you've got convenient voting via smartphone or computer cheaply. So what it means is that government can engage far more regularly and often with citizens. There is, in fact, a blockchain-based voting group here in Australia called the Flux Party. So we have our own blockchain party, and their proposition is you vote for us and we'll let you vote on everything. So look up the Flux Party, it's rather fun. But on a serious note, this really does offer some potential for government to increase engagement with citizens, and also for things like social accountability, to be able to more frequently engage with citizens or stakeholder groups to get their views on different issues. So move through the next slide, Serena, which is health, onto the one with a little bit of detail on it. Yeah, thank you. So there are a whole lot of ways, and we've been seeing a number of them during the pandemic, that blockchain can be applied to the health sector. So in terms of payment systems, and it's been used already during the pandemic for people to make insurance claims, financial inclusion for poor families, and there are a number of countries, including Britain, who are exploring how this can be used, not only for poor families, but also to try and save SMEs who are really suffering as a result of the economic slowdown, and direct health incentive payments. So in poor countries, for example, some governments want to give mothers small incentives to attend antenatal visits, and this can be done using blockchain. We've spoken about supply chains for vaccine protection and provenance. Telemedicine is something that's really escalated during the pandemic. So telemedicine and remote care, and although it's not being used in this way, telemedicine can also be matched with tokenized payments so that you can receive your consultation and the medical provider can receive an immediate tokenized payment. So supply chain management we've spoken about, and blockchain-based polling for social accountability. Just a couple of last slides, Serena, if you wouldn't mind going on. I also want to highlight for you that probably in the same way as I've emphasised that the humanitarian settings in the pandemic has really accelerated innovation, I also want to point out to you that what we're seeing is a move in terms of digital innovation from the West. So Global innovation leaders who've been US and Germany are ceding ground to emerging and developed Asia. China and India are becoming hotspots for global innovation. And there was a study of 20 innovations in mobile banking services where 85% originated in developing countries and 50% were first pioneered by the users because they're solving their own problems. Second point, next slide please, is that digital is giving small states opportunities to be able to overcome some of the disadvantage of size and geography. So small and nimble, many of them are using their microstate status as a boon to technological innovation. And some of you have probably seen in terms of blockchain and digital assets, countries like Bermuda, Mauritius, Serbia, UAE, Malta, Gibraltar, Isle of Man, Liechtenstein as being some of the leaders in digital assets and digital asset regulation. Next slide. Why do I think emerging economies are going to be the innovators and where we see the transformation? First of all, size and scale. Over 1 billion smartphone users are in China and India, compared with only 220 million in the US. Most of the young people are in emerging markets. 85% of the global population, where nearly 90% of people under 30 reside. Mobile penetration is increasing. We have about 70% of the world's population covered by mobile, and this is growing every day, and that growth will be in developing countries. They have huge problems to solve, and so they're going to be likely to innovate and welcome innovation. And their governments will welcome innovation often because of the lack of legacy systems. One of the challenges that places like UK, US and Australia have is we've already got pretty good systems, and so there's a lot of resistance to changing them. In many cases, emerging economies don't have that problem. So you've got young but increasingly well-off and tech-savvy populations with mobile devices and good network coverage. You've got 660 million mobile users in China and 400 in India, and emerging markets are at the forefront of latest technological developments, and they're showing their capacity to innovate. Move on to the last slide, please. Oh, no, we missed that one. Let's go on to this one, sorry. It's a coordination. No, go on to the next one. I've done that one. Okay, so, you know, what I think is really powerful is this statement because it's true. For the first time in human history, we have the technological tools that will enable us to connect the bottom billion unbanked to the global economy and to provide digital identity to stateless people and to direct benefits to the poor and vulnerable. We have never in human history had that capacity before. Next slide, please. If we harness it, if we use it properly, if we move purposefully forward, blockchain can bring identity and economic opportunity to the poorest and most vulnerable anywhere. So that's the end of my presentation, and thank you all for listening.
Thank you so much for being here, Jane. We're really grateful that you came to speak with us. And unfortunately, it seems like that did run a teensy bit over, so we won't pause and we'll quickly move along. But thank you once again, Jane, for coming on and speaking to us a little bit about some of the other applications for blockchain that I think a lot of people wouldn't have initially assumed were possible, especially the one about procurement that I think could possibly surprise quite a few people. So thank you very much, Jane. And hopefully we'll hear more from you during the upcoming academic year if you come back to work with us again.
Okay, thank you, everyone, and go forward and do amazing things with your lives.
Thank you, Jane.